With the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 27 years, this TV series has provided programs about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for issues and viewpoints that are not often heard in mainstream media. Most of our TV programs examine substantive issues such as nuclear weapons, foreign policy, or economics by laying out hard facts. But sometimes, including this month, we look at the world around us through stories and the values and insights of people who actually are working on issues in a variety of ways. We start this month's interview by recognizing that the world's problems result from a dominant worldview that is actually selfish and harsh. Albert Einstein said you can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it. And so our guests for this program offer their experiences and their insights toward solving these problems with different viewpoints from those that are dominant in our society. We also examine how fear holds us back and how hope can move us ahead. We encourage viewers to discover your own best values and act upon them to make the world a better place. We recognize that this is how our society has made the most progress in the past, and we can move ahead into a better future if we act on our best values. To accomplish this, we have four guests. Next to me is Zannah Herridge-Meyer, who, although young, has traveled extensively, has accomplished a lot, and has accumulated experience and wisdom beyond her years. The other three guests are people I've known and respected for a number of years. They have worked in a variety of ways, and each of them has previously been a guest on this program. I'm happy to welcome Zannah Herridge-Meyer, Dennis Mills, Jody Mackey, and Bob Zeigler, and I welcome all the viewers to watch this program. The United States and some other countries operate our societies, our economies, our foreign policies, and so forth, based on a dominant worldview that to me seems very harsh. And knowing you folks, I sense that you're seeing it in a similar way. And the premises and the assumptions into this dominant worldview are that it's a tough world out there, and so you have to arm yourself and be willing to use violence against other people. And success means controlling other people. And it's okay to boss other countries around and stuff if you're the U.S. And use up the Earth's resources and sell them and just throw away the trash that's left. How well does that dominant worldview serve us? What's going on with this? Does that really meet our needs, or what are your short critiques of it? And we'll be doing more later. Anyone?
Well, that worldview gets us into trouble both nationally and internationally. And unfortunately, that is a predominant national view within the United States, but we're seeing that played out almost every day on network TV.
Mm-hmm.
Dennis, you're working weekly, maybe daily, with the vets who have gone out to other parts of the world to install that sort of action and the repercussions for those vets.
And those repercussions come home. So we see these, what we call failed foreign policies. We see it failing in the lives of those who participated in that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King talked about the bombs that we're dropping in Vietnam explode at home. And it's amazing how really true that is. Mm-hmm. And it's the scars that we have. Here, there is not only from a military-industrial complex, but also from there's the impacts on vets and our whole societies. Mm-hmm. That we have many problems that we've never really addressed.
Mm-hmm. When we see, Bob, those problems that were problems when we were young men 45 years ago are still problems today for the grandchildren in those countries that our failed foreign policies took place.
So in contrast to this harsh and really counterproductive worldview, it would be fun, and we'll do this during the program, to propose some alternative assumptions and premises for a different worldview that would be more satisfying to us as human beings and as people who live on this planet. What assumptions or premises would you like to see as grounding our economics, our foreign policy, and other aspects of our society? We can just toss out a few ideas.
An important one to me, and I think to all of us, would be putting people before profits. And that's something that often underlies a lot of our own policies, whether it be domestic or foreign, and also just underlying our economic system. So switching that, not profits before people, but people before profits.
Mm-hmm. I think respect is very key too. Mm-hmm. It being able to respect others, other cultures, to respect the dignity of peoples, and to not try to control, but to partner as equals, not as a person who dominates.
Yeah, we have this that American lives are worth more than other lives, that we've all done some traveling. It's not true, and it doesn't serve us. It doesn't serve America. Mm-hmm. In the short run, it does if you have money and you want to make money.
It serves some people's needs, but still, it seems to me it doesn't serve the needs of the broad public interest, but a few people. Right. And then in the long term, we all end up losing, I think.
Yes.
Bob, you and other folks have said that the current worldview that our system is based on involves a great unraveling, and this great unraveling concept came from a book and a concept, and you mentioned that when we were preparing for the program, and you and other folks have offered alternatives that would instead be a great turning. Could you explain that concept or what those differences are?
Okay, well, I ran across a book down at Traditions. It's called Active Hope by Joanna Macy and Chris Livingston, and I bought it and read it, and that was the concept that she had in there. And it's a concept of hope. It talks about, we've got a lot of dysfunction in all aspects of our society. And there was that a lot of things are unraveling. A lot of the systems are unraveling. She talks about a great turning, and that's moving from, a society of economic growth to becoming a society that sustains life, a life-sustaining society instead. And that's where we need to be moving.
Sounds reminiscent of the native belief of 7 generations. All our decisions need to be for the good of the next 7 generations.
Right.
Yeah. Other thoughts on that contrast?
I've been lucky enough to work in fair trade for over 18 years now, 19 years. And so I get to see this
I
way
didn't know you
of
started when you were a kid.
respect, way of respect and treating other just like we would our family, and transparency, and the kind of connection and support that lifts up everyone involved in the system.
Yeah, it seems like this change from the dominant foreign policy and economic policy and so forth, criminal justice policy, all these things that are heavy-handed, to one that's more sustainable. Not only, it seems, has those practical applications, but it makes a difference to the human spirit. I mean, the systems that we have are so anti-human and so deadening to this human spirit. And I'd like to very much see an alternative kind of society that values things that actually make people feel better and be psychologically and spiritually healthier instead of what we've got now. It's just a stark.
It makes me feel better just hearing you say those things.
You didn't know I
Much
was
less do
for
them.
that
Yeah.
stuff? So, but I mean, it's beyond the tangible. You know, it gets into very intangible and psychological and spiritual things.
Yes.
And I'm hoping that we'll reflect on some of these things during this hour.
Well, and we're talking about values too, Glenn, and many of us value those that we're close to or those that agree with us, but we often diminish the values of those that disagree with us.
Yeah, yeah. The enemies.
Yes.
Yes.
Or the enemy of the month, or the enemy
Yeah.
that we were told is our enemy.
Yeah, enemies that have been chosen for us. Yeah, I like the slogan from the World Social Forum movement that says another world is possible. It's like, yeah, let's open up some possibilities and see what we really want.
So it's just reminding me of so many folks in America think that might makes right, that this is really what will keep us safe and keep us having enough. But there is another way, and that's, I think, what we're going to be talking about.
Yes, and we're already talking about it. And my question for you right now then is, what is it in you that causes you to choose this other way? What are the values or your beliefs or your groundings that cause you to say that this dominant worldview is not what we want, we can find better ways? What? Anybody have anything to offer on that?
Well, I'll start off with one, and many of you might know that I come from a Quaker perspective, and we have a unique position where we see that of God in each person. And it's not just that of God in the 5 of us, but in everyone, including those that we disagree with. And it affects how you treat others and how you see others when you see that part of God in each person. It's also why I don't have enemies.
Well, you haven't created any. You haven't made anybody into an enemy. Yeah. I had a good friend from back in the 70s, and he was a very aggressive person, and he kept getting into tavern fights. Every place he went, he'd get into tavern fights. And he said he never threw the first blow. He couldn't figure out why everybody wanted to hit him. But I knew this guy, and he was really bossy, really staked out his turf, and kind of had a tendency to elbow people out of the way, verbally and in every physical way, until somebody would haul off and slug him. And he didn't know what he did that caused people to want to haul off and slug him in the taverns. Yeah. So, but it sounds like our foreign policy a little bit.
And you know, another value that I have, and I know many of our panelists have, is that we're part of something bigger than just ourselves. In that we have that sense of belonging, but we're just a small part of that. And so we have that collectiveness together, or as the military says, that camaraderie together.
Yeah. There's also something, Bob, you mentioned when we were preparing for the program, you mentioned this quotation from Martin Luther King about a true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. And King was, of course, drawing from his religious faith, but also from a real sense of the unity of all of humanity. It wasn't just his religious denomination or his ethnic group or something, but there's this humanity that calls for a revolution of values.
A sense of equity.
Yeah.
And I think, there was, like in my own life, it was, I grew up in a segregated city in the Midwest, and I couldn't see anything wrong with segregation, as I was a kid. People had their schools, we had our schools. There was a swimming pool for in the black area of town, a swimming pool in the white area of town. And there really wasn't any mixing. It was a real segregated society. And I didn't see anything wrong with that until I was 12 years old. And then I realized that Bob Gibson, who was the best baseball pitcher, maybe in history, wanted to buy a home in Omaha. And he was African American. He could not buy a home next to where I lived. And then I thought, this is not right. I mean, it's totally backwards.
Yeah.
But there was a sense of equity and just being able to see where, lead me to see other things aren't equal and aren't right.
Yeah. And all of us have had, I know from our conversations and just knowing our friends here, everybody's had experiences that have led to some insights. And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is have each of us in sequence, starting with Bob and then Jody and Dennis and Zannah, share some stories that you either know about firsthand or thirdhand, stories of other people, or third person, I should say, not third hand. Although some stories do circulate, that's great. Stories or insights of what other people have done or what we've done. And for example, Bob, you have a long, decades of history working with people from El Salvador, and you've gone there, and you have some insights into their lives and struggles and things. I know there are some things that you could share from people from El Salvador that would shed light on this discussion.
Right, there's a generosity among the people, especially among the poor. And I was in people that were squatters. They lived in shacks along the railroad tracks, and they had 2 chickens, and they invited me over for dinner, and they killed one of the chickens to feed me for dinner. Now, if I was them, I would say, hey, that guy could go without a meal, And there was, and rationalize why it'd be good to keep the chickens, but it was that level of deep generosity and sharing. And it's also, they had a sense of gratitude, too, that I've seen also among Native peoples. There was a Native American, a homeless man, who used to say, our Coast Salish culture is a culture of gratitude. And it helped them focus on what was positive. And I think looking at what's positive is very, very critical in developing worldviews.
There's some success stories out of the Zone of Peace in El Salvador. Tell us a little bit about that concept of Zone of Peace and what the people did that you found moving.
Okay, this was in rural El Salvador in the province of Usulatan. There was, near the coast, there was 86 villages. These are rural areas, farm workers mostly, and small farmers. And they organized, they had to flee during the war and go to Panama. Then they came back, and in some of the land reformation deals that came about in the peace accords, they got some land back. But these folks, they declared their area a zone of peace. This was right after a war, and there was extreme violence. And at the same time, it was 5 years after the war, and many refugees had come to the United States, and kids here had got involved in youth gangs in the big cities, and they were deported back to El Salvador. So 30,000 people, kids from the U.S., were deported from the U.S. to El Salvador. So El Salvador suddenly has a gang problem. And there was extreme violence. And so they're mainly women who decided they knew what was right and what was wrong and weren't going to settle for what was wrong anymore. And they decided they wanted a local zone of peace. And they're going to declare the area zone of peace. I thought it's a good concept, but everything's working against them. Our government policies, their government policies, the international economic order, everything is working against them. They wanted to restructure their society. And what they did is they didn't focus on how bad everything was. They didn't look at the whole structure, but they started concentrating on what they could do. And little by little, they would build on what was successful and focus on what worked and then build upon that. And they brought in conflict resolution trainers who worked with the teens and adults, and they had continuing meetings every week. The teens and adults would meet, talk about what was right in society, what was wrong, what they needed to do, changes need to be made. And the level of violence after 5 years dropped to practically nothing. When we were there in 1998, the peasants hired armed guards for us. You know, we're going down for local peace march. And we had armed guards, and it just seemed totally illogical. 5 years later, after they had worked on this, there was no violence in their areas. They had other things. They were kids were getting out of gangs, getting into art projects and other things that were developed for young people. And all the stuff was pulled off bottom up, but by focusing on the successes they had and building on those. Yeah. So again, the whole focus on the positive, I think, is important because we get so hopeless looking at everything seems to be crashing.
Yeah, that would be a great model to export from El Salvador to our country and other countries and to a lot of sectors of society. I want to move on to Jody. Thank you, Bob. That's great stuff. I always appreciate your stories and insights. Jody is a great storyteller in our community, and the people love to hear you tell stories. I wonder if you could share some for this program. You've done a lot of work actively with the Afghan peace volunteers. It's mostly young people. Well, a few years ago, they were younger than they are now, but they're growing up. But largely young folks, and they've been doing courageous work for peace and nonviolence, drawing upon the teachings and examples of Gandhi and King and others. Most of these folks are young. Tell us about that boy you told me about on the phone who had to drop out of school at the age of 9.
Zekrullah.
Yes.
9 years old. He did construction at night. He went to school during the day. He hauled in crops, and sometimes he did 6-hour trips with a donkey to pick up firewood for his family. He didn't have time to sleep, much less do his homework. In Bamiyan and in much of Afghanistan.
Bamiyan is a province in the middle of the country where these people are.
You're exactly right. Yeah. In Bamiyan, if you showed up to school without your homework, then you put out your hands and you got 10 swats for however many days you had missed your homework. And so he's 9 years old and he's up to 60 swats. And he's not going to get his homework done the next day. And so he goes home and he goes to his construction work, and he doesn't go back to work to get the 70 swats that he would have gotten. So he drops out and joins the Afghan Peace Volunteers and does vigils that get him noticed by Americans. And that's how I first got to know about Zekrullah, are through these vigils in the peace park that they had created, the first peace park in Afghanistan, in the snow, in a tent, asking our president to recognize their desire for peace. And so eventually, the U.S. Ambassador Carl Eikenberry went to meet with the Afghan Peace Volunteers. And Eikenberry asked Zekrullah to go back to school. He said yes. And so it's been 4 years. He's about 13 years old, and he goes back. Well, now he's 18, and he's in the 8th grade. And because he's been part of the Afghan Peace Volunteers, he knows a lot. He knows more than most of the teachers do. And he's 18 years old in the 8th grade. And so he's in an ecology class that he loves this work. He knows all about it. He knows the answers to all of the questions, and he has time to do his homework. But they still do corporal punishment there in Afghanistan. So there's all of these kids at the beginning of class lined up to get their swats, right? They're 10 swats. And so Zekrula starts to stand up with them, even though he has his homework done and knows the answers. And he asks if the next 7 kids can go sit down and he'll take those swats. He does this day after day, week after week. Zekrula is his name. It totally confuses the teacher. Teacher doesn't know what to do. Teacher will happily give him swats, and even moved up to rattan, which is a more painful form of administering these swats. And Zekrula still stands up there day after day. Now, some of the kids who are in his old situation, they're working after school, they haven't had time to do their homework. They're finding time so that Zekrula doesn't take their swats. But the teacher keeps, like the teacher even failed him for his midterm exam, even though Zekrula knew all the answers. The teacher doesn't know what to do with this, but he studied Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and he insists on being one with the people around him.
You do a lot of good things. Thank you for that story. That's a great one. One of the things that you could talk about on the show is the movement that's part of the climate movement and the environmental movement from Native people in Canada that spread to the U.S., the Idle No More movement. And you have the description from their website that is very articulate in saying what they're about. And it's just a couple sentences. Share that with us, please.
Idle no more. Our people and our Mother Earth can no longer afford to be economic hostages in the race to industrialize our homelands. It's time for our people to rise up and take back our role as caretakers and stewards of the land. So Idle No More started a couple of years ago. It's a woman-led movement, a Native woman-led movement, and they've had thousands of events already. They've had long-term blockades of disaster mine areas. They've had a woman chief do a 50-day fast to get some of the ecological destruction stopped that's happening in central and northern Canada. And it started because a Native lawyer went home to her family, and her family had to truck in water. They aren't even that close to what's the mining and the destruction that's happening, but the chemicals have leached across much of Canada. And she said, I have to do something about this. It's only been a couple of years, and they are having a very powerful impact, completely nonviolently, and it's even happening down in the United States, too.
Good, thank you. Dennis, people know you through various kinds of work you've done. You've done a bunch of stuff. You have your hand in a lot of good projects. Some people don't know that you have a PhD in educational design.
Guilty.
But you're using the skills that you developed through your academic and professional work to provide educational services in other ways. Tell us what you're doing. Tell us about the Friendly Water for the World, what that project is, and some of the things that you've done to help them.
Well, Friendly Water for the World was started here in Olympia, Washington as a nonprofit to teach others how to clean their own drinking water, which would end their illnesses and often early childhood deaths in the family.
Because of these little microorganisms in
the water that they had to drink. And many times they had to go 5 or 6 kilometers to get the water that made them sick. And so we teach them how to use a very elegant, simple technology involving very special sized sand and gravel in a cement container, and we show them how to make it. And this particular contraption, if you will, is called a biosand water filter.
It is so low tech.
Indeed.
And part of what's cool is, like, unlike some things where, holy crap, the thing broke down, we have to send to New Jersey, USA and buy spare parts. This is low tech,
and it lasts for 30 years without maintenance.
And you teach people how to make them there in their own local area.
And we teach people to make it as a sustainable enterprise. So, for instance, we work with widows who were widowed by ex-child soldiers, the child soldiers at the time, and they come together to form a cooperative, part of their healing program. But then we teach them how to build and market biosand water filters, which is ending the disease and early childhood deaths in their area. And so where I use my skills rather than going to these countries, and we're in 10 different African countries, and you've been to Afghanistan where we trained you and your husband how to do that. I provide the educational materials because that's the background that I have. So I design websites, video, training materials, and then I get involved on training people here. And just recently, we trained a 13-year-old who went with his father to India for several weeks, and then several months later, he went back to Uganda and Burundi. And so here's this 13-year-old child from Yelm, Washington, making a difference in the world. And so I get to use all the knowledge, skills, understanding that I had during my working years in a very meaningful fashion.
And you do a lot of work through Veterans for Peace, and you help folks who have been through the military but are not getting the benefits that they deserve and are entitled to by law, and you've done study to be certified by the VA.
Mark
Tell
Fleming,
us about that work.
Well, Mark Fleming and I.
Mark is the technical director for this TV program.
For this program right now, and thank you, Mark.
He's in the control room.
And
as we
Mark
speak.
and I have gone through the training program and passed the test with the Veterans Administration so that we could represent veterans all the way to the Court of Appeals, Washington, D.C. if necessary. But we help them collect the materials so that it becomes a fully developed claim where they can receive compensation. So, for instance, just a week ago, one of Mark's clients was able to get 100% compensation for himself as well as his child and wife, and now his needs are being met because he will receive this tax-free income, where before he was very, very desperate.
Yeah, and I know that the part of the motivation from this is that as a member of Veterans for Peace, you want to make sure that the government owns up to its responsibility, and we know that the Pentagon and the VA have been trying to save money by depriving people of disability benefits and other benefits to which they were legally entitled.
Well, often the Department of Defense treats the veteran, the soldier, as a piece of used, broken equipment that can be just disposed of. And we say, not so quick. If you want to know the total cost of war, it is taking care of humans for the rest of their lives that have honorably served. And so that's part of what motivates us to do this on a weekly basis.
Yeah, it's the right thing to do, and it's all volunteer on your part. You and Mark just do this volunteer at your own.
Well, and another thing that's just real interesting too is this new Quaker Underground Railroad.
That's another one.
And that's another one that we get involved with, because early in the Civil War, Quakers were involved in taking the slaves out from the South to the North in what they called the Underground Railroad. Well, in Uganda, they've passed laws to outlaw or criminalize, if you will, people from the LGBT community, the lesbian, gay, transgendered,
and
bisexual community, or claim to that they are. Some of them aren't, but then they are often outed by their family, the church, or killed. And so we have formed a new Underground Railroad, and we've successfully got 439 people out of Uganda to other welcoming countries where they're safe.
That's great. It's very impressive. So thank you, Dennis. Zannah, you've done a lot of things, even though you're not old like these old geezers are. But you grew up with humane values and values about sustainability and economic justice and so forth. And you started doing some work when you were in high school around health. Tell us some of what you did in the high school years and other young, like college. Tell us some of that.
Well, I grew up in this community in Olympia, so I was definitely saturated and very involved from a young age with working with people from all over the world through my father's fair trade store, and also seeing the importance of community development and of creating peace and community spaces. So that was kind of the underlying values that I grew up with and feel very grateful for. But in high school, I became involved with Teen Council, which is through Planned Parenthood of Western Washington, and we were trained. We're from all different high schools, and we were selected to be a member of this group and trained on a variety of subjects regarding health education. So I was lucky to be involved for 3 years. So we would go to middle schools and high schools, do presentations on reproductive health, on HIV/AIDS, on nonviolent communication, on teen issues, and then at the end of each program or training, people would have the opportunity to ask questions, anonymous questions, and then we would have the training to answer that. So it was a really wonderful experience and really opened me up to the idea of reproductive health justice, the importance of health education, and then also just seeing how knowledge is such power. And so that was a very transformative time in my life.
And you kept on doing things health-related and grassroots-based. Tell us some of the work you did between high school and college or during college.
Yeah, so after I graduated from high school, having done that work and been very passionate about health and public health, I was curious if I wanted to be doing medicine, so I decided to take a year off and travel and work in clinics and see if that was something I actually wanted to be able to do. So I spent time in Dominican Republic working with some nuns there who are from the United States and who had been very connected to a specific neighborhood within San Pedro de Macorís, which is a town in Dominican Republic. And they had been very involved in that community, and a lot of the people that worked in or lived in that community were working in free trade zones within Dominican Republic. So a free trade zone is when it can often say made in the US, but really it could be in the Dominican Republic in a zone that's created free of taxes and all these other regulations within it. So it could say made in the US, but really people are often working in sweatshop conditions.
Yeah, without the benefit of US laws,
exactly.
but the illusion that it's a US product.
Exactly.
Product,
so seeing the impacts of those policies on the people that were, did not have access to health care or any type of education, and seeing that was really an important connection that I was able to make, between the things that you learn about in school and then actually what that means for communities.
And you've done a lot of work in Africa as well.
Yeah, during that same year I was in Togo through Olafia, which is based here in Olympia. They do amazing work, Olawanjo. They work in Togo, have a shea butter cooperative there, and then have a lot of projects that they have developed from that. So I went with my sister and we worked in the maternal health project and went into villages and also, worked within the clinic to learn about what these amazing, incredible midwives were doing and the work that they were, it was very impactful.
Great, thanks. So out of the things that we've shared and the many more things that we could have shared, all of this stuff requires some courage, some boldness to step out of our comfort zones, or even just in living in our society, there's stuff going on around us that might be frightening to us. It's like, oh, somebody from a different race moved into my neighborhood, or oh, there's some people from another country and I don't know if I can trust them, or all this. There's all this fear out there, and then we have politicians and others who exploit fears for their own purposes. And it seems when we started this program, we talked about the things that are wrong with the dominant worldview, and some of that was fear-based because, well, you have to get some guns and arm yourself, and you have to elbow your way out ahead of other people, because you have to fear other people as competition. And I wonder, you had a story, Dennis, from some years ago, early in the Iraq War. You were talking with somebody who was
we were vigiling
fear-driven.
with FOR at the park, and we had the signs that FOR provided. And one person walked up and says, "Do you believe in that?" And I thought, well, yeah. And he says, well, how are you going to protect all the terrorists that are coming in with atom bombs to the port of Olympia? And I thought, well, that's a real stretch. And I says, well, you know, and it dawned on me, like, don't blow this person off, hear him out. And I says, what is it that bothers you? And he says, well, I'm a parent and I have 2 daughters at home. Well, I had 2 daughters, now adult daughters, but 2 daughters. And then I asked him, how many Iraqis would we have to kill until you feel safe? And all of a sudden a light went on. And he says, I'll have to come back and talk with you about that. I don't know what prompted me to say that, but it's sort of like I can't come up with an argument that would do that, but just to recognize that this is a human, and he was truly scared that someone was going to endanger his family. He really had fear. And so I just asked him, well, what will it take to stop that fear? How many people must we kill as our foreign policy?
Yeah. Well, so often, you know, so much in our movement, you know, we think, well, if we can just get the information to the public, if we can inform the public about the facts, then they'll come over to the good side of an issue. And very often there's some underlying
Well, there wasn't
fears.
a sign that you could hold up that was going to change his fear.
Right. Well, you had a person-to-person thing, but you connected at that kind of a human level with exactly the question that needed to be asked to get at the emotional underpinnings. And it's kind of like what we're doing with this TV interview today here is you know, what's going on at the human level beyond the facts, because if we're going to make progress on all these issues that we care about for the environment and climate and peace and economic justice and human rights and so forth, we have to get beyond the facts. I mean, certainly use facts, but see what's going on with people at the values level or at the emotional. I thought that was just a great story. It's worth sharing now and then. Do you have something?
Yes, there's the unfortunate thing is I think fear sort of sells. I mean, people kind of like being afraid, and the news media, I think, takes advantage of this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, I mean, if you watch the news, you're going to end up afraid of something, and it's kind of interesting. It was, there's an entertainment show, it's a daily show with Jon Stewart, and sometimes in this entertainment show, I think you get more news than you do in the regular news. But this last week had a medical professional on, and he asked him, he said, how long is it before we're all wiped out by Ebola here in the United States? How long do we have? Do we have 10 days? Do we have 20 days? And the medical professional says, John, you've got no chance of dying from Ebola. And Jon Stewart says, have you watched the news lately? But that's to say that Ebola isn't a terrible disease, and that it isn't something that we haven't properly responded to in Africa. But there's so much fear out there.
Yeah.
And I think it's leading to some strange deals. You know, you've got congressmen talking about Ebola coming from Mexico. You've got with people, with these kids that flee from Honduras gangs in Honduras and so forth. There was, but fear is used a lot, and I think that's one thing that, you know, is important to counter. And the other thing is that, I mean, we ourselves paint a pretty gloomy picture when we're giving all the facts, because you've got global warming, we've got diseases, we've got, there was terrorism, we've got perpetual war that we're buying into. And you know, you can take and say, is there any way out? There's this one woman in a book, also on hope, Rebecca Solnit, in her book, Hope in the Dark, talks about that, you know, it's true, we're in some really scary and dark times, but these dark times are like the darkness of the womb. And so as on the margins, there's all of these creative things happening, about to be birthed. And Martin Luther King Jr. also had the similar deal. It's the most starless midnight often heralds the brightest dawn of fulfillment, one of his quotes. But I mean, you know, it's just being able to counter fear is critical.
Right. Yeah. The role of hope when we were preparing for the program, Bob shared a lot of really great insights from Rebecca Solnit and Joanna Macy and others about the role of hope, and we need to be working that angle. And hope doesn't mean like a blind optimism of like a statistical odds that, oh yeah, it's going to turn out just fine. It's not that kind of thing, but it's like we have that potential, and I think of these movies and jokes where the family's in the car and the kids are in the back seat. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Well, no, we're not there yet. But on these issues, as long as we have folks working on them, we're making some progress. But we're not there yet. But there's a chance that we might get to where we're going if we, stay with it. You mentioned earlier the role of gratitude, and there's a number of positive things that people could be doing that, or your example with El Salvador, where you build on the things that work. So here we're trying to turn around a society through this zone of peace, and you reinforce and build upon the things that have already been somewhat successful, and you build on those. And we don't do enough of that in our society. We have a problem. We have a government write a report on it, and it never gets acted on.
There's a movie I saw. It was Happy. It was on PBS a while back, and there's in this movie they talk about gratitude and how people one thing that you can do is write down each day 5 things that you're grateful for. And it's important to do that, to take into a journal and just to see, so that everything is not a disaster.
Yeah.
Well, Glenn, one thing I notice is that our viewing audience on Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation spans a great age range. So I'm retired, but then there's people that are watching that are working adults, but there are also youth that are involved. And each of these groups can become involved in some way that's making a difference. Just as I mentioned, this 13-year-old who's gone to 3 different countries to teach biosand water filter. And that's a 13-year-old. You don't have to be 73 or retired. You can do something at whatever age level you are.
There's and we'll in a couple of minutes I want to explore that angle about inviting people to be reflecting on their own values and their own sense of what the world is that they want, and find ways to plug in and do that. Before we get to that point, I want to just touch one more thing on the hope. Joanna Macy has done great work back in the 80s when we were on the verge of blowing up the world with nuclear weapons. She did workshops on despair and empowerment in the nuclear age, and more recently she's been working with activists and others around areas of despair and empowerment and hope, and she's developed a 3-step process for active hope, and she has 3 things. One is take a clear view of reality, so understand what's really going on. Second thing is identify what we hope for in terms of the direction that we want to move in, so figure out what's the reality, what's going on, have a clear sense of that, and then get a clear sense of what direction we want to move toward, and then take some positive steps to move in that direction. I mean, this is simple, straightforward stuff, but so often we tend to get stuck, and we let politicians or brainless media keep us stuck instead of moving ahead. There's such potential. I mean, who would have thought? About 100 years ago was when Gandhi came back from having lived in South Africa for a long time. He came back in 1915, moved back to India, went all around the country, and really started in India making a fresh kind of progress on their independence. And who would have thought that these people could have made independence from the biggest military power of that time? And it took them decades to do it, but they got independence against that big empire. Or who would have thought that the civil rights movement in the South could have prevailed against the very entrenched and very brutal white racist power structure that was just keeping a lid on everything. And I mean, you can do things against odds, and with smart strategy and a nonviolent commitment.
Glenn, looking at reality clearly, there's so many different views of it. We have it that war is the way, so many Americans have it that war is the way to keep us safe.
Yeah.
The world spent over $2 trillion on war in 2012. But supposedly if we'd spent 5% of that, 1/20th of that, we could have eliminated poverty in this world, in the whole world.
Yeah.
How much war would that have eliminated if people had enough?
Yeah.
Also, we have it that war's natural among us, that we're going to struggle and fight. But there are societies that have lived for 1,500 years without war. Like, if people look clearly, will say, they'll think that war is natural, and it's not. We don't have to live this way.
So much of what we need to be doing is debunking the assumptions and the premises that underlie that power structure that's really quite self-defeating, and lift up the alternatives. And there's a good evidence, and part of it seems, I mean, is the starting point could be reflect on your own values. What really do you believe in your guts, in your heart? You know, what are the values that give your life meaning, or that, you know, and then act on that, and you change the realities, because you change the reality that Britain is going to run India forever, and you change the reality that the white power structure is going to keep injustice in place forever. So we can really do that. There's all kinds of evidence and history showing that nonviolent actions really work.
How long have we tried war?
Yeah.
It's not doing a good job.
Yeah, how well has that worked? What's the evidence? Yeah, I mean, at the very least, you end up with a winner and a loser, but most often you end up with two losers.
Yes.
So, we want the viewers to be able to act upon their values, and urge the viewers and the viewers' families and people they care about to reflect on what is it that really gives your life meaning, what's substantive for you, and what world you want to create, you know, and then find ways to move on that. And we shared a few stories among you folks of things that you've done, but there are lots more stories out there, and we need a lot more hours to do that. There's a concept. This also was in Rebecca Solnit's book that you had told me about before we taped the program. This politics of prefiguration, the idea that instead of just like waiting to achieve something over here, you start living that, and you prefigure that reality that you want by living it incrementally, and you live the revolution into being, you know, which is like, whoa, that's a great way to go. Yeah.
There's Zannah had talked about her experience in Laos, and with the Buddhist temples there, and some stuff that is some of that, it seems.
Yeah, in the Buddhist community, especially in Laos and in Thailand, young men are expected to go and serve at least a year as a monk. During their age, you know, it varies, but often, you know, around the age of 17 or 16 or so. And during the time that I was there, it really was striking to think that instead of, say, in this country where often men will go into the military during that time or something like that they were having this time to learn the values of Buddhism, to be taught that, and to be stripped of all possessions, and then every day have to go for alms, where members of the community would offer food and other things that would sustain them throughout the day. So there was a real sweetness in that concept, you know, within Buddhism, that we could take that time, you know, especially within that very pivotal point in your life.
Yeah, because that's the time when kids go off in other directions, like you say. They're joining the military, or they're getting into a gang, or they're taking up some unhelpful substance abuse or whatever, and how cool it would be to do that instead. Yeah. The sense of potential for this thing is that if enough people did enough reflecting on their best values, not the stuff that's just been programmed into you, but they're really genuinely best values, and acted on that, how much leverage would that give to have a shift in the societal consciousness of things? You know, you get consciousness raising. There are times in history when like all of a sudden it becomes gross and disgusting to tell a racist joke, or it becomes gross and disgusting to smoke in your college classroom. Like when I was in college, people would smoke in the classroom, and then you can't do that now, and it's like gross and disgusting. How could we do this so that using violence would become gross and disgusting, and it's like, oh no, that's, you know, that's so 1950s, you know, or something. So you could get a shift of public consciousness, and it would be fun to look at how might we do that on the different sectors that we've talked about the environment or economics or foreign policy. I'd be interested in that sometime. Maybe some other hour we can explore that angle. But the movements that have made actual progress in U.S. history, the labor movement, you know, all of a sudden there it is, environmental movement, there it is, and there's these shifts in consciousness. So I would just urge viewers to pursue that. Can we get a brief thought from one or two people, and then we need to wrap this thing up? But we got to be brief. Is there some compelling thing that hasn't been said yet?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that often it becomes, especially of people with my generation, very overwhelming to figure out what issues you want to address, and how, you know, the more we learn how connected all these issues are, whether it's the environment with health or economics with our political systems, it becomes very overwhelming, and can lead to a lot of apathy, to not want to address anything because you feel like anything you do isn't going to make a difference. So I would say that there is such an importance of recognizing that it's okay to choose something to put your energy into, and doesn't mean that that will be the only thing, or it's the only thing you're going to do forever, but to continue to put that energy towards something, and it does make a massive difference. It's the accumulation of all of those actions that we're taking.
And other people are going to be choosing other things. So you work on the environment, but somebody else is working on foreign policy, and somebody else is working on economics.
And it's that combination of the grassroots movements, but also recognizing that policy changes also make a big difference.
I want you've got something. It's got to be brief.
If you want to be with people who are filled with honesty and transparency and courage and resiliency and humor, it's, you know, step into these causes, and you'll be with people that exhibit all of these
That's
qualities.
right. It's good for the soul.
It's good for the soul.
Yeah. I want to thank Zannah Herridge-Meyer and Dennis Mills and Jody Mackey and Bob Zeigler. I want to thank the folks who've been watching. I remember Hans Christian Andersen's old story had a kid able to say out loud what the parents, the adults, recognized, but where they were too timid to say. The kid said, "The emperor has no clothes." I think we're at a moment in history where more and more people realize the emperor has no clothes. We need to be able to say it out loud, and we need to be able to offer an alternative, a different way, a new society. So we encourage that. A good starting point is to reflect on your own values, your own beliefs, what gives meaning for your life, and what kind of world you want, and then walk the talk. Start doing the things that you actually believe in, and recognize that you're not alone, like you said. And when we do that, we'll find other people who have compatible values, and we can connect, and then strengthen numbers. And at some point, we reach a tipping point, and we can really move. So we invite people to connect with other people, with nonprofit groups. Remember the World Social Forum slogan that says, "Another world is possible." You can get information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093, www.olympiafor.org. We are all one human family, and we all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.